Thank you, Acting President, and I'm pleased to rise today to make a contribution on the debate into the decriminalisation of public drunkenness. And let me be very clear from the outset, the Reason Party will be supporting this legislation today. We think it's a very important step to start framing substance use and misuse as a health issue, not a criminal one. But I think more importantly, it's another step to reducing deaths in custody, particularly the deaths in custody of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, who we know are 10 times more likely to die in custody than non-Indigenous people in Australia. And we certainly haven't rushed to get here. 30 years ago, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody made 339 recommendations, one of which was to decriminalise drunkenness. As we've heard today, there's been many other reports, even from this very own Parliament, about public drunkenness. We've seen every other state in Australia decriminalise public drunkenness. So I'm pleased that we are finally here. And I'd like to really acknowledge the very hard work of Narita White from the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Services, Jill Gallagher from VATCHO, the Human Rights Law Centre. But as most of us today have acknowledged, the Day family. We know that Tanya Day was much loved and a proud Yorta Yorta woman. She was removed from a train and taken into police custody for being intoxicated in public. In fact, she was asleep in public. While in custody, she sustained a serious head injury, falling in a police cell and dying 17 days later. And if that wasn't tough enough, that a mother died in custody, the fact that in 1982, her uncle also died in custody made this even more tragic and certainly almost more poignant. And to think how strong the Day family has been to continue on this campaign. Because Harrison Day died in police custody in Echuca in 1982, having been arrested for a $10 unpaid fine, a charge for being drunk and disorderly. So I thank the Day family and the many First Nations people and families who have brought this to this House today. Because while Aboriginal people account for 0.8% of the population in Victoria, they're 6.5% of public drunkenness in Victoria. They account for 6.5% of all public drunkenness offences. So I welcome this recommendation, I welcome this amendment to the Summary Offences Act to decriminalise public drunkenness. And this obviously was recommended 30 years ago by the Deaths in Custody report. This was recommended by the expert reference group, Seeing the Clear Light of Day. It was recommended by the coroner's report, and as we've heard, recommended by many other reports. And we've heard from Mr Grimley, Mr Borman and certainly Mr O'Donoghue about some of the concerns from the police, and I too met with the Police Association and heard some of their concerns about this. They're concerned that they're going to find themselves at the front line ill-equipped to help someone who's intoxicated. They're not going to know how to manage this. And frankly, this is what we heard. They're not equipped to manage this. They don't have the appropriate health and community-based skill sets. If you look at the testimony that the police gave in the coroner's report, they couldn't find a service available for Miss Day. The local resources such as the Aboriginal Community Justice Panel, which is a volunteer service run by VALS, the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, they're so profoundly under-resourced, they were unable to intervene on that particular day with Tanya Day. And in fact, Mr Borman's story and reflecting on a circumstance that he was in as a police officer when he was not able to help a person and that person died in custody. While Mr Borman was using that as an example to oppose the legislation, in my mind, it just further strengthened the fact that police are not equipped, and it's not right when you think someone is very drunk, dangerously drunk, to have them locked in a police cell with the police, with their, with all the goodwill in the world to keep that person safe, but certainly not the skills to do it. And that poor man that Mr Borman spoke about, who sadly died because he was bleeding on the brain, to me was just yet another reason why we should be welcoming these amendments today. And we should welcome them today. We do not need to delay this any further. We do need to fund organisations. There is no doubt about that. And we know, and in fact, had this been funded earlier, maybe Tanya Day could have actually had a different future, had a different pathway, and maybe her family would not be missing her every day, and children without a mother and grandchildren without a grandmother. So I support the initial budget announcement of $16 million, and I think that will certainly go a long way to initiating the reforms outlined in the Seeing the Clear Light of Day report. And we saw that, despite what we've heard today, that we're not ready to do this, and maybe we need to get ready to do this, we've seen from that report, we're very ready to do this. We're more than ready to do this. In fact, we've been trying to do it. In fact, as I'll take up Mr Limbrick's interjection, we should have done this 30 years ago. This is something that we are well behind in. And I acknowledge that the legislation is largely a vessel. It enables us to set up the systems that will keep people safe, to establish pathways to a health response rather than a criminal response. And also with that 24-month, so this isn't going to be implemented tomorrow, as you'd kind of assume by some of the contributions we've heard today. This will be implemented in November 2022. We have a number of months to get this right, to prepare for this, to train for this, to establish services. There'll be 3 trial sites, as we know, Mildura, Dandenong and the Melbourne CBD. And what might work in Fitzroy will not work in Mildura. And this is what we're going to look at. And when I look at the ERG, the Expert Reference Group's recommendations, of which there are many, they also talk about the fact that there may be other legislative powers that will be required. So as we are working towards this implementation, we may see that we may need to give some strictly limited further police powers in a strictly limited way to enable police to detain people or to transport them. But there is so many other recommendations here that set through really clear pathways, that talk about staff ratios for sobering up centres, that really go into significant detail. So I don't think that we are not ready for this, that we need to delay this while we try and work out what we're going to do. We know what we're going to do. The Expert Reference Group has given us a very clear path, has given us very clear recommendations and instructions, as did the coroner in her report. She went to great detail in discussing what changes needed to be made in the health system, what changes needed to be made in our emergency response when someone is found intoxicated in a public place. I think, of course, that this is the first step also in treating all drugs as a health issue. We speak about this often. We can't keep arresting our way out of the drugs issue or the drug war. We have to treat drug use as a health issue, and this does that. But I would love to see us go further. I would like to see the decriminalisation of drug use across the board. Of course, treating it like a health issue, treating it as a health issue, because that's what it is. So I am pleased to support this bill. I thank Ms Watt for her really powerful and personal stories. What gives me great optimism about this legislation, probably for the most part, is that when someone is intoxicated to that degree, they're in trouble. They need help. And when someone is, as we see in some of our regional areas, and certainly as I was hearing about in Mildura, when someone is getting picked up every Friday for being so intoxicated that they can't walk, then they're not getting the help they need in that police cell. What they actually need, and what this bill and what has been laid out in front of us by the expert reference group, is a pathway to help. That first point of call, when we treat that drunk person as someone in need of a health response, not a criminal response, that also opens up the doors to further rehab. And I will watch with interest as we start preparing for this legislation. I will watch with interest as we start establishing the systems and putting them in place. I will watch with interest the trials that will be underway over the next 2 years. And what I really hope is that this is, for many people, the first step to recovery. That this is not that they go into a sobering up centre and then leave, that they are then given the opportunity to take that next step to recovery, that this is actually a non-judgmental, a non-stigmatised way of enabling more people to seek help for their drug use or misuse, and I commend the bill.